Hello and welcome to It's All Academic, the Open Learn podcast from the Open University. Open Learn, of course, the free learning platform of the Open University, and this is your free learning podcast and covering a range of subjects. And today we are asking, how is your gut? And we're going to be talking to Dr. Vikki Haley, and we're going to be talking about the gut microbiome. So if you want to learn more, if you want to know more about having a healthy gut and what a gut microbiome is, then stay tuned and we'll introduce you to Dr. Vikki Haley talking about the gut microbiome. Welcome, Vikki. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, good morning again. Hi.
So let's get started on the gut microbiome. So I know what my gut is, but tell us, what is a gut microbiome? What is a microbiome and what's it doing in my gut? Introduce us.
Well, I think probably most people will be familiar with the gut microbiome, but probably just under a different name. So historically, it was always sort of referred to as the flora within our gut or those friendly bacteria. Um, Sort of the gut microbiome itself, there's different names. So it's sort of it can be sometimes people are using those names interchangeably, but they mean slightly different things. So the gut microbiome is composed of trillions, and we're potentially up to 100 trillion microscopic organisms that are living inside our gut. And that's right from the mouth all the way down through our esophagus, our stomach, small intestine, and large intestines. And these microscopic organisms are composed of a lot of mainly bacteria, and most of the research is done sort of on bacteria, so that's where we kind of know the most, but also viruses, fungi, and another type of microscopic organism called archaea. So those microscopic organisms, along with the gut, is known as the microbiota. And then those microscopic organisms, the gut, and then all of the substances that they produce and their genetics and any structural element is what's the gut microbiome. So sometimes you'll hear sort of gut microbiota, sometimes microbiome. They're slightly different things, but a lot of people, as I said, use them sort of fairly interchangeably. So
And let's start with a fairly big question. Why is this important? I mean, yeah, I think gut health is something we're probably all becoming more aware of. It's definitely a bigger subject than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago for sure. But why is our gut microbiome, why is gut health so important?
well, I mean, there's so much research going on into the area of the gut microbiome because it is becoming so clear how important it is for not just our gut health, but our health throughout our whole body. And part of that, as I mentioned earlier, that the gut microbiome do make certain substances, and those interact in so many different ways with lots of different body systems. So the gut microbiome interacts with our immune system, and there's a sort of, there's a lot of communication both directions between the immune system and the gut microbiome. It interacts with our nervous system. So we've got what's called the microbiota gut brain axis. So actually, our gut microbiome influences how we think, how we feel. Even things like our motivation to exercise can be influenced by the health of our gut microbiome. So it's becoming sort of just increasingly clear through the research just how widespread the effects of those little microscopic organisms have on the functioning of our body on an everyday basis. And actually, if we kind of lose our healthy balance of our those microscopic organisms, it can really start having an impact on our health. And a lot of sort of quite complex chronic health conditions have been shown to be sort of linked to this sort of loss of diversity or loss of balance of those microscopic organisms. So yeah, it's really important for our health, sort of more broadly.
Definitely want to sort of come back and ask you a bit more about that, sort of the overall physical and mental health and the impact. But Rija, what impacts or affects the organisms that we've got? I mean, is there anything that we do as individuals that affects our own gut health? Is it sort of conditions beyond our control? What are the influences on our gut health that we can and can't control? If we can start with that question.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting question. And again, I think there's a lot more that will come out in the future, but we know that some of the things that affect I should start by saying everyone has a very unique combination of microscopic organisms, and it's about the diversity and the balance of those organisms. So anything that changes the diversity and the balance of the microscopic organisms in our gut can then start sort of affecting our health. And some of the things that affect that sort of balance and diversity are sort of intrinsic to us. So it's things we can't change. So our age, and particularly in women, we see quite a big change in the sort of diversity of the organisms during menopause. But as we get older, we tend to see a sort of shift in the kind of diversity of the organisms we've got. Our genetic makeup can have an impact. Um, but then there's other things that we can influence, geographical regions. So I've got the world map, funnily enough, behind me, but actually how close or how far away we are from the equator, for some reason, and it's not sure whether no, we're not quite sure through the research yet what that reason is. Is it dietary? Is it other environmental factors? Is there something else going on, genetic, maybe, that's influencing that? But some of the big things that we can do to improve the health of our gut microbiome, diet is probably the big one that we know the most about. So, eating a lot of fruit and vegetables and whole grains in particular, and that's because those microscopic organisms use them as food sources. So almost like we're feeding those friendly, good bacteria in our guts by eating lots of whole grains and lots of sort of fruit and veg. Um, Foods that they don't like are ultra processed foods. There's quite a lot of research that if particularly with the Western style diet, which does contain more processed foods and particularly ultra processed foods, is thought to be having an impact on the health of the gut microbiome. But then there's all those things that we kind of know that are good for us, but actually, affect our body in lots of ways. So exercise, meditation, sleep, keeping our stress levels down, all of those things actually will have quite a sort of, obvious impact on the health of those microscopic organisms and that sort of diversity and balance that we want. So
So it's not just what we ingest, not what our body absorbs in terms of food, drink, and so on. Actually, like I say, things like meditation, you're sort of looking after your mental health, sleep. That really has a physical effect on the gut as well.
yeah, and absolutely, and one of the things that the I think is really fascinating is the vagus nerve, which is helps to keep us calm and keep our stress levels down, communicates directly with those microscopic organisms of the gut microbiome, and again, it's that bidirectional communication. So, if we are meditating and we're more relaxed and more sort of, kind of not quite so stressed, the vagus nerve is going to be communicating more effectively with the gut microbiome, which is going to be releasing lots of substances, which is then going to be communicating back to the vagus nerve. And that's, again, where we start seeing those effects in terms of our mental health, like our mood, um, and our cognition, our memory, our decision making. So yeah, so lots of positive effects from all those lifestyle things that we know are good for us, but sometimes can be a bit hard to implement if we're a bit tired and stressed.
Is that actually like the physical manifestation of when we get nervous, when we're feeling anxiety, and we say, "Oh, yeah, I can feel it. I can feel the nerves. It's in my stomach." Is that actually the physical representation of those feelings that we're having, that nervousness, that nervous energy that we physically feel in our guts?
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure how much the gut microbiome is contributing that, but certainly the vagus nerve, which is sort of, as I said, is our sort of rest and digest almost, and the counterbalance to that, our fight or flight. Kind of, there's a lot of activity of that part of the nervous system in the gut, and also the gut also releases a lot of hormones, which again activates the vagus nerve. So yeah, so there is scientific evidence showing that actually when we say, "Oh, I've got a gut feeling that someone's not a good person," or something's making me quite anxious, there is a biological aspect to that, and a lot of that is linked to that vagus nerve, the sympathetic nervous system, and something we've also got something called the enteric nervous system, which is all part of that sort of bigger nervous part of the nervous system that kind of yeah, there's a lot of nervous supply in the gut itself.
You mentioned as well before, you said about the sort of the gut brain axis, I think it may be called. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And that seems crazy that there is literally a super highway between between our brains and our guts, so that they're communicating with each other. I don't think that's something that most of us really think are so connected. But can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how that works?
I mean, again, there's, it's quite complicated and this is really still being unpicked by the research. Um, so as I said, the vagus nerve is one of the big communication pathways, and certainly, one of the things that has been found with going back to the gut microbiome very quickly is that if you improve the health of your gut microbiome, because that is then activating the vagus nerve, which helps with that rest and digest, it does help with our mood and our anxiety. So again, all these things are interconnected. But yeah, the gut is quite often known as the second brain because it does have so many nervous connections to it and sort of nerve endings. Um, so really, yeah, and the vagus nerve and the hormonal cells within the gut wall are all there kind of sensing that internal environment of, what's in our guts at that particular moment in time. And then all of that information gets communicated up to the brain. And then the brain will kind of process that information and send signals back down. So we have got this very, I always think of it as an information superhighway, really, between the gut and the brain. And it does affect more than just a big part of it is obviously sensing what is our gut doing, sort of digesting, absorbing the food, processing all those nutrients. But a lot of it is about, sort of there's a lot more to it than just around digestion. As I said, it is going to be affecting our mood. There's also big connections between the gut microbiome, that vagus nerve, and the immune system. And so those are all communicating as well. So, all of these things are so sort of everything in the body is interconnected in all one way or another. So it's sort of, things don't tend to work in isolation. So, but yeah, the gut brain axis it's, a very interesting way that what we're eating and our gut health is actually affecting how our brain is functioning. So.
I mean, does it stand to reason then that the healthier our gut, the healthier mind and body? I mean, is that a direct correlation that if we're sick with something that isn't gut related, but would it sort of show, would it, if you took an extremely healthy person and someone who was feeling incredibly ill and were able to take a snapshot of their gut at that time, would we see a real difference of, a healthy person, a healthy gut, a sick person, a gut that's in much worse condition, the microbiome not performing as well as the healthy person? Is it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see it. It's not, we certainly see it in a lot of sort of chronic health conditions now have been linked to what's called dysbiosis. So that's when we've lost that balance, we've lost that diversity of the organisms in our gut. Yeah, there's two species that are particularly important, and it's also about the sort of ratio between those two species. And what we do see is in this dysbiosis is linked to a lot of chronic health conditions. So things like some of them affecting the gut, so things like irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease are both associated with dysbiosis. But there's also other factors. There's genetic factors. There's immune factors sort of that come into play. So what's not clear at the moment with a lot of these conditions that are sort of linked to dysbiosis is where in the process the dysbiosis comes in. Is that the sort of triggering event, and then maybe the immune system starts overreacting, and then that puts everything else out of balance? Or is it maybe that the immune system has responded to an infection, it's overreacted, and then that's caused damage to the gut microbiome, and we get this dysbiosis? But certainly, as I said, it's, we do sit in sort of several gut conditions, you get this dysbiosis, but also in a lot of other conditions. So a lot of mental health conditions are linked to dysbiosis. So depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, but again, is it a cause or is it a consequence? That's what's not clear at the moment. But as we were talking about earlier, at the start, that actually it's becoming clear that because the gut microbiome is having an effect on our health throughout our whole body, as soon as our gut goes out of balance and we develop dysbiosis, it can be linked to lots of health conditions. Um, Other big ones are type 2 diabetes, and obesity is linked to dysbiosis. And again, that's something, there's a lot of research going into, potential, treatments of these conditions, by improving the health of the gut microbiome, can we actually improve, the health of those individuals with those conditions? It might not necessarily be a cure, but it might improve their prognosis and it might reduce the symptoms that those people do have. So.
Is there anything that people should be looking out for if they're seeing signs of anything in particular that might point towards it being, that they need to address their gut microbiome. They need to make some changes. What would be the first sort of things, the first symptoms or the signs that people might see that, right, these are your pointers. This is you needing to make a change. Is there anything that everyone should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, there are symptoms. So unfortunately, there's sort of general gut symptoms that you can get, for a lot of things. But so it can be quite hard sometimes to kind of identify exactly what's triggering it, or if it is dysbiosis. Um, so it's a lot of things, just sort of generally feeling a bit unwell, fatigue, maybe a bit tired, sort of some bloating and distension, maybe feeling a bit sick, sort of change in bowel habits. So it's the sort of thing, that, we a lot of things could give you the same symptoms. So that's why I think a lot of the times, um, people have dysbiosis and just don't know because they just think, oh, I've eaten a bit of rubbish food, it's making me feel a bit unwell. And actually, it might be if you're eating kind of, I think this is where, I think the whole thing's quite fascinating in terms of stress. Is obviously when you get stressed, your body releases cortisol, which means you crave fatty, sugary foods. That then, isn't good for your gut health. That then triggers the vagus nerve, and you end up in a bit of a vicious cycle. So, and you just end up feeling, just a bit, oh, meh in yourself. So, yeah, so there's nothing kind of obvious a lot of the time that you could say this is definitely dysbiosis. But it is becoming, increasingly well known that that is a potential, problem for people, particularly, in higher income countries that are eating this more Western style diet. So, I think that, the availability of tests for that will probably increase in the future where people could check at home, just to see on how healthy their gut is. So
You're saying this all the Western diet, you mentioned that a few times now. I mean, is that a change that has been seen worldwide, I suppose, as sort of Western influences have spread across the world? Are you actually seeing a change in um, the results in people, the health in people worldwide as these sort of the fast food culture, I suppose, has spread across the world? Is that having a negative effect worldwide, or if they, are we countering? Are we reaching that point now where we are countering, where we've realised this is happening, and so people are trying to reverse the situation? But I would be really interested to know, did we see previously really healthy guts in certain areas of the world? Has there been a change in that as these habits, this Western culture and foods and fast food culture maybe has spread?
I think it's probably a bit difficult to say whether the health of the gut has changed much just because the sort of research methods, are quite new and sort of probably even 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have really been able to measure very well, how healthy people's guts were. What we are seeing is things like inflammatory bowel disease, which we know dysbiosis is part of that early process of inflammatory bowel disease developing. And certainly in the UK, the sort of the frequency of that of inflammatory bowel disease has increased a lot since the Second World War, and it seems to be one of the theories is it's sort of linked to increasing industrialization. Um, and it used to be that inflammatory bowel disease was quite sort of much more frequent, much more prevalent in high income countries with this more sort of Western style diet. Whereas now we're starting to see, quite big and rapid increases in inflammatory bowel disease in sort of low to middle income countries who are adopting a more Western style diet. So at the moment, you can't say that's definitely causing this increase in inflammatory bowel disease. But certainly, as I said, that we know that dysbiosis is a big part of inflammatory bowel disease. We know that ultra processed foods and that Western style diet is increasing dysbiosis. So, you know, a definitive link is yet to be proven, I think, but it certainly looks like that there is a sort of some sort of pattern there.
Okay, I mean, really interesting. You said about sort of the methods for being able to find out what's in the gut. What is that method without being sort of going too graphic, perhaps? Or but how do we measure that? You said there are, what, 100 trillion organisms that live in there. There's fungi, there's bacteria. How do we know that? How do we get that sample and get to that understanding of there being so much in there? So how do we get it? And yeah, how do we know exactly what's in there?
To be honest, I'm not an expert on the techniques of here, but there is a lot of, I said 100 trillion. There's a lot of sort of variability in the estimates that come out, and they are estimates because to be honest, to completely quantify not just the number, but also the type of organisms in a gut is really difficult in a living person because you can't kind of cut them open to have a look. Um, and so, there are really wide ranges. Some research says there might be 30 trillion, some say up to 100 trillion, and the numbers are changing again as sort of the experimental techniques become sort of more refined, kind of have new advances. I mean, but even just how many, in terms of the different species of bacteria, there's huge ranging numbers, with I think sort of probably about 10 years ago, it was thought there was maybe 4 or 500. Newer estimates are saying there's maybe 3,000 different types of species. But what makes things part of the reason it's so challenging is as individuals, as I said, we'll have very unique gut microbiomes in terms of the microscopic organisms that live in there. Is although there might be a potential 3,000 different types of bacteria, it's thought that each individual may only have 150. So actually, you have to then sample so many different people to kind of try and actually get the full number of potential bacteria. And again, that changes over a lifetime and changes over, if someone travels a lot and is going to be exposed to more environments where they're coming across more different, different bacteria and foods, that can then change, you know, the microscopic organisms that live in their gut. So it's really difficult. Um, and as I said, to be honest, I'm not an expert in how this is all measured. So
For people who are listening who are maybe stomachs are starting to churn a little bit, or their minds are racing now at the thought of there being 3, 4, 500 different bacteria living in their gut. Just to put everyone's mind at rest, you said and mentioned it earlier as well, I think, good and bad bacteria. Bacteria in the gut is not necessarily bad. We need good bacteria. That's right, isn't it? Just if you can just give a quick reassurance to people that bacteria in your gut is actually, it's what you want. It's not all bad. There's some good as well.
Oh, no, I mean, for me, I think that it's absolutely essential for us to have those bacteria in there. I don't think we would be able to survive in the way that we do if those bacteria didn't exist. As we talked about earlier about having lots of different effects, they help us digest some of our food. So just from, being able to get access to nutrients, they make really important vitamins like a lot of the vitamin B12, a lot of the B vitamins are made by those microscopic organisms. But the other thing they do, and again, this is where having a really healthy gut microbiome is so important, is because they're kind of living in our gut, they stop bad bacteria or pathogenic bacteria that can cause disease. They stop that from those bad ones from colonizing our gut. And that's something we do see, with someone who has got maybe a reduced number of gut, of good gut bacteria, they can have an increase in the bad bacteria because there's just more space for the bad bacteria to kind of grow and sort of multiply. So, just purely from that point of view, they're very protective of us in terms of getting, quite bad infections. Because, I think we all know that some bad gut infections are pretty horrible. So, so for me, I think, having a healthy gut microbiome is so important for, just all of our health, really. And it's something that, as you said at the start, I think something that will be, becoming more and more sort of mainstream in terms of, we really need to look after our gut health. So.
And going to jump about a little bit on this one, but this is something from one of the videos. If you haven't, anyone hasn't seen them yet on the Open Learn YouTube channel, there's a series of short videos, and Vicky's produced some brilliant videos for us there, and sort of 30, 60 seconds long, just giving you some really good insights into things. And one of those videos, you mentioned about serotonin being produced in the gut. And I thought that was a really interesting one. So I think immediately that is not something that I associate personally. I don't think, well, that's come from my gut. Serotonin, I very much think is a brain thing. So I'd just like to know, yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about that? That's a completely new one. That blew my mind that serotonin is produced from down there and not up here.
Well, and actually, sort of about 90 to 95% of all the serotonin is made in our gut and not in our brain, which, is just amazing because, you always do think of, serotonin as a sort of brain chemical.
Mm.
And it is really important, it's so important for our mood and, if anyone's had depression, they'll know that a lot of the sort of antidepressant drugs are it sort of work to increase the amount of serotonin in our brain. So, but again, this is another way that the gut and the brain communicate. So there's two sort of main sources of serotonin in the gut. One, again, the gut microbiome, those microscopic organisms. That's one of the things that they do make some of the serotonin from the gut that then crosses the gut wall and into the bloodstream and will travel around up into our brain. We've also got special cells in our gut wall that produce, a whole range of different hormones. And a lot of those are things that help us to sort of digest food, maybe affect our appetite, how full we're feeling. So a lot of them are around sort of, nutrition, that sort of digestion. But yeah, they also do produce serotonin, which again enters the bloodstream and sort of will travel around the body and up into the brain. So again, we've talked about the vagus nerve communicating between the gut and the brain, but we've also got a lot of hormones that are released by the gut that enter the bloodstream and sort of go up. And again, it's that communication system so that the brain knows what's happening in the gut. Is it full of food? Does more blood need to go to this area because we need to digest lots of food? Are we full? Have we eaten, too much? So yeah, but yeah, it's very interesting. I think that serotonin and certainly some of the kind of gut conditions like irritable bowel syndrome. Um, is thought to be linked again to dysbiosis, but also to changes in some of the subtypes, changes in the amount of serotonin that's being made by the gut. And then that's affecting the sort of motility of the gut and the function of the gut.
So this part of our body that for all these years that we just thought, we consume stuff, it goes into the gut. It's the thing that maybe gets a little bit too big at times. It feels a bit bloated. This is actually a really clever bit of our body. This is not just a thing that is there and just, like I said, gets filled, gets emptied, feels a bit fat, feels a bit bloated. It's a really clever, intelligent part of our body. Then I personally had no idea it was as clever as it is.
Yeah. No, and it absolutely, as I sort of said, the gut and the gut microbiome, they're affecting pretty much everybody's system, the kidneys, the heart and lungs, everything. And even on a cellular level, they'll be affecting, sort of how the DNA's kind of being used in individual cells. So, yeah, as I sort of said, I think the guts increasingly is going to get a lot more attention over the next few years. And, unfortunately, it means, less chocolate and crisps and more fruit and veg. So that's probably why I think at Christmas sometimes you can end up feeling a bit kind of not great after you've sort of spent a month eating rubbish. And that's probably, as we sort of talked about earlier, maybe our gut microbiomes are telling us it's time to go back to a slightly healthier diet. So.
I mean, on that, you mentioned diet. That's quite an interesting one. Is there can we be too dramatic when, like I said, when post Christmas, we're going to January, you go, right, a health kick, and we cut out all of those things that are bad for us and go, right, I'm going to eat this, and it's going to be, cut out the dairy, no red meat, I won't drink alcohol, I won't have sweets and chocolate. I mean, do we need a little bit of a balance, or can we kind of shock our systems a little bit too much if we make really big dramatic changes?
I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't know whether, I don't know personally or what, through the research whether, we can shock our system. Because again, sort of studying that's probably quite challenging. I mean, certainly, because we have got the, quite a broad diversity of bacterial species, all of those will kind of be requiring, sort of certain nutrients in order to be able to kind of, you know, for them as an energy source and to be able to kind of grow and thrive. So I think sometimes being very restrictive with diets, you know, might not necessarily be a great idea because you can then end up losing certain species of sort of bacteria. And certainly lactose intolerance, this isn't so called, mostly this is caused by a genetic thing, but when you're lactose intolerant is actually the sort of bacteria in the gut produce lactase, which is the enzyme that you need to break down the lactose. And one of the recommendations is you still need to keep eating some lactose because if you cut it out completely, you're going to lose the few bacteria that you have got that can use that as an energy source. So you can actually end up making things worse if you're kind of too restrictive with your diet.
Well, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now as we sort of head towards the end of this episode. The first thing I'm going to ask you about is why this is your area. How did you come to know so much about the gut microbiome or have an interest in moving to this area? And the second thing I'm going to ask you to end on is sort of a couple of tips, maybe three things, three practical things that people can take away with them from this episode. So I thought I'd mention that one now. So while you're answering the first part about how you got into this, if you're smart and maybe your gut can help you with this one, it can help you process the answer while you're talking and come up with those three tips to finish. So yeah, just really interested why this area is your area of expertise. How did you come to be involved in the gut microbiome?
Well, I kind of first started sort of really getting sort of reading about it because it's actually part of one of our modules, and I've more recently been writing a bit for a new module that's coming out about particularly about the gut microbiome and inflammatory bowel disease. But I think as a obviously I think I have a dual interest really because as a scientist, I think it's just such a fascinating area, and I think for me, I very much when I sort of learn or write or teach about the human body is about the fact that everything is interconnected. And I think, we've touched on a lot of the connections that gut microbiome has on, the immune system, the nervous system, all sorts of the hormonal system. And so it's absolutely fascinating these connections really between all of these different systems and just how much it affects our body. And I had no idea before I started really reading about it about just how widespread the effects of the gut and the gut microbiome were throughout the body. And I think it's really opened my eyes that I need to be a bit healthier in my diet and sort of, try and have a bit more fruit and veg rather than, sort of chocolate or biscuits, which is, biscuits are my big nemesis. So, um, yeah, so it's just such a fascinating area. And I think because as I said, there is so much research going on. And I've sort of got a real interest in how, the body works, but then how it goes wrong to sort of, in terms of health conditions and disease. So I think for me, the fact that the gut dysbiosis is linked to so many sort of really important health conditions, I think it's just such a, really fascinating area. But I think it's an area that we still don't really understand. There's so much coming out that, it explains a lot of things that we haven't really been able to kind of explain in the past.
Oh, well, there you go. As Vicky just mentioned, I'm going to talk for a moment so she can ponder on those topics. I'm going to buy her a few seconds of time. Yeah, the Open University has module. You can study with the OU on on this fascinating subject, and of course, you can visit us on the Open Learn website, and you can take the free course. It's a little sort of sample of that, and yeah, delve into the gut microbiome for free and watch videos and explore various of the content that we've got, of course. And I will buy a couple more seconds by saying, if you're enjoying this, then make sure you give us a follow on this channel. Yeah, it's all academic from Open Learn at the Open University. And we'd love to hear from you as well. If you've got any questions, if there's anything you'd like to know, particularly around this subject, then drop something in the comments and we'll do our best to get questions answered until we can contact Vicky after this and put some of your questions to her. And so I think I've afforded just about enough time now to say, right, wrap us up then, Vicky. If there is three things, if we can, that people could take away from this today that they can take forward, improve their own gut health, changes they might want to make. What can you tell us? How can we help ourselves?
I think, as I said, diet is the big one, and it's just sort of your fruit and veg, and it's the whole grains in particular are really important. So things like oat and seeds and things. So I think even just sort of adding small adjustments. I don't think you need to be drastic in changing your diet. I think just increasing those and trying to reduce those ultra processed foods will have a big impact. Exercise is the other big one. And what's really interesting is the type of exercise actually has different influences. So even sort of what's called sort of low to moderate exercise, so things like walking or quite gentle swimming is really good for improving the health of the gut microbiome. And number three, I'm trying to think of a third one. Sleep. I think sleep again is one of these things that more and more is being shown how important it is for so many different parts of our body and our health. So, yeah, sleep is a really big one in terms of just again your general health. And the more stressed you are, the worse the gut microbiome tends to be. So, if you can get sleep and reduce your stress levels, I think that would help as well a lot. So.
So diet, exercise, sleep. There we go. Three practical things, and if we can all take a little bit, do a little bit better at each of those, then a healthy gut, a healthy body, a healthy mind, a healthy human. How's that for a summing up?
I think that sounds perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Vicky. That's been as if that's been fascinating to dive into the gut. It's that doesn't sound like the nicest sign off, but it has been absolutely fascinating to dive into the subject really today. So yeah, thank you very much for your insight, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And if you've enjoyed this, please do remember, give us a follow. We would love to see your comments. We'd love to see some fantastic reviews. So yeah, follow the channel, comment, review, and join us again for our next episode coming very, very soon here from It's All Academic from Open Learn at the Open University. And until then, goodbye and see you soon. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this clip, feel free to follow the links on screen for more interesting articles and free courses from the Open University.